Julian, hello. Welcome to the DevOps Diaries podcast. What a pleasure it is to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. You are absolutely welcome. I am super excited to have the opportunity to chat to you today, Julian, and bring your experience and your knowledge to the listener of DevOps Diaries. Um, given a little bit of an intro, so the listeners know what to expect. But um, I would love to hear in your words and for the listeners to hear in your words a little bit about who you are and a little bit about the experience that you're going to bring to us today on the podcast.
Yeah, happy to share. Yeah, so Julian Joseph, he, him. I'm a Salesforce DevOps engineer with a background in Salesforce for about 8 years now. I've actually done a mixture of quality engineering, DevOps engineering, technical support. So been both customer facing as well as more on the back end with development teams. But yeah, I've worked at a few Salesforce partners on the ISV side, as well as at salesforce.com/.org, which is the nonprofit division within salesforce.com. So I was there for a couple of years, most recently at a startup Salesforce partner called Agent Sync. I'm actually currently in between roles, so looking for my next opportunity. But yeah, just love Salesforce DevOps and love, yeah, just getting more people excited about some of the things I've done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with that with that intro, it's evident that why I'm excited to chat to you today and bring some of your experience to the listeners. Um, you mentioned a plethora of roles, but your job title is primarily now is Salesforce DevOps Engineer. I think that's a really curious thing for the listeners. A lot of roles, and when I speak to folks in the ecosystem and the Salesforce teams, DevOps is seen as something that is done. And if you're an admin or a developer, you are part of a development process. Give us a little bit of insight about how DevOps came to be your specialty and the thing that you solely focus on in your role in the ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, with a lot of my role changes, it's always been a bit of mixing in the new role I'm interested in, some of the new tasks and transitioning to it. And so that was the same with DevOps. My most recent role before DevOps was quality engineer, Salesforce quality engineer. And I was a quality architect for a bit as well, which basically just meant I was developing more of the plan. And so that actually, I think, naturally led into DevOps through way of automation. So when you're testing, you always want to be testing in more efficient ways whenever possible. And one of the ways to make it more efficient is to add in automated tasks. And so you're automating that testing. If you heard about UI testing, or using some even like load or performance testing, which usually uses some level of automation, those were the areas I was getting into and finding a new expertise in. And that actually just led me to keep asking that question of how do I get more efficient? How do I help my team in better ways? And that's where DevOps came into play. So a lot of times when you are wanting to automate when those tests are run, you're thinking about ways to trigger them automatically by developers or by different actions that the development team is doing. For example, whenever you make a change to the code, you probably want to run some level of testing. And so I was beginning to set that up on my team, thinking about when to trigger these tests. And that really led into, hey, there's a lot more that can be triggered even besides just the testing. For example, you can trigger things like reviews from other developers. Uh, you can trigger like information about whether or not the code you are writing is stylistically compliant with whatever you've decided as a team you want that code to look like. And so all these actions are just kind of like little automations that when you add them up together, it's basically the role of what a DevOps engineer does. And so I was beginning to assist my team with each of these little tasks. And at some point, it just made sense. Hey, this is my role. I'm doing this on a day to day. Why don't we make it official? So I can dedicate more of my time to this task. And that's how I made that transition.
Wow. Um, tell us a little bit. So the quality, like quality engineer or quality assurance as roles, I think, is something that might be a little bit hidden for a lot of folks in the ecosystem. Generally, you see admin, developer, or architect as the main kind of functions, I guess, if you like, of a Salesforce team. From that experience as a quality engineer and the QA side of things, um, can you tell folks a little bit about what the role of QA is in Salesforce development and Salesforce testing, and then we'll jump into some of the things that you mentioned there about your kind of transition into the automation and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, happy to. Still very passionate about testing and quality engineers, and I think we need many more of them on development teams. But yeah, typically a quality engineer, I'd say they're taking a set of tasks that's often already being done by the team, but probably to varying degrees of success. And so whenever a developer is making a change or an admin is making a change, you need to make sure that that change is actually happening and that it's happening in the ways you're expecting, and also that it's not impacting any other related components or other features or just other parts of your Salesforce org that you don't want to be negatively impacted by that change. And so that action of verifying is usually called testing. And so often that testing is being done at least by either a developer or maybe the product owner on a team. But a quality engineer, when they join that mix, they are really dedicated to that action of testing and verifying. And usually, since they are a dedicated role, they're probably going in steps deeper than the developer would go or than that product owner would go. Not just testing some of the obvious things, but exploring and thinking of new ways, new creative ways of, let's say, breaking that application and verifying that, ideally verifying that it's not going to break, but if it is, notifying the team so that they can be aware that that's happening. And they're probably also adding in other perspectives to that, um, to that, to verify that scenario. And so, for example, it could be somebody who might have an accessibility need. That tester might be kind of representing that person using something like a screen reader for those who are vision impaired, or checking for things like color inversion or color comparison compliance, or making sure that double clicking for those who have motor skills, making sure that those different scenarios are not impacted. And so basically representing those different people and testing for their situation. It could also be, I mentioned load or performance testing. It could be taking testing to, you could say, another level in terms of making sure that maybe not just that one action doesn't break, but if you perform that same action 1,000 times or 100,000 times, that doesn't break or it doesn't slow down the system to a point where it's unusable. So basically, like thinking about more creative scenarios to do this level of verification and expanding upon it and being the dedicated person on that team to be the expert on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So far beyond just making sure that you have test classes, you run your unit tests, and then any uh, any functional testing that goes on. Does this work as as it should? Yes, okay, tick a box. But then taking that to that next level for multiple scenarios. And do you see that as would you see that as a area that perhaps smaller teams are kind of missing out on when you think about, so you mentioned things that are like accessibility and being able to make sure that whoever is using your system and the platform can use it in the same way as any other user that might have those kind of impairments or what have you. Do you feel that that might be something that hinders smaller businesses versus the enterprise is that typically would have more money to invest in a team and have testing of that level?
Yeah, it definitely, testing roles, unfortunately, are often not thought of probably till a team gets to be a certain size. I have thankfully seen some smaller organizations even like think of testing early on. There's a lot of benefit to having either a dedicated tester or at the very least really thinking strategically about the areas you're going to be testing from day one. A lot of times the features that you're building, they are going to be much more expensive to change down the line to make them, let's say,
Right.
accessibility compliant or make sure they perform at a higher level. Of course, you always have to have some trade off between time and resources and making sure that you get something out, you get something available to people, versus testing it. Like you can always think of new things to test and you can always take more time
Yeah.
to test. But I think emphasizing it early on can really pay off, and having somebody with that mindset. There's a lot of great tools out there that assist with things like accessibility testing. Some even like Chrome extensions, or just built-in tools like I mentioned, screen readers that's built into every computer to some degree. And so there's ways that you can do testing, even for what is thought of more complex or unique scenarios, from day one. It doesn't have to be something that you think of down the line. But all in all, I would say I would always recommend for a small team to be thinking of that testing component as one of the main areas they do need to be investing in. Maybe it's not a fully dedicated position, but at the very least, making sure that they're considering it in their architecture, that their architects are thinking about it, developers are considering it, from right when they start building their app.
Yeah, quality is not an afterthought. It's something that is baked into the process and how you develop things in the first place, of course. Of course.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so if we come back to a little bit of that transition that you made to more of a DevOps engineer rather than just focusing on the quality, you mentioned things like automation and triggering tests and being the kind of foundation of that. What's for you has kind of been the biggest part of that learning journey? Like we think about DevOps processes, and a lot of us that operate in the space, we think about, automatically running your tests when um, you move features to a new environment is something that's just, of course, you should do that. Like what was kind of your approach as you started to look at some of these automated things in a DevOps process? What were kind of like the key aha moments for you as you went from I want to automate these kind of tests to thinking about what we might otherwise be able to automate, or what parts of the process could be changed to really be successful?
Yeah. I'd say a lot of that comes from just listening to what problems people are facing on the team, or what points of friction people are facing, whether it's the testers or developers or designers. Just listening for, especially if you're on a Scrum team, you're doing Scrum, especially at like retrospectives. That's what I found to be one of the most valuable places to get that kind of information. Almost undoubtedly, you'll begin to hear things, especially a team that's been working for maybe a few months at least, if not a few years on a product. They're going to be saying things like, oh, this one process, it's really slowing us down. It might be reviews are slowing us down. They're taking a long time. Or it might be that merge conflicts, like we're merging code and we keep running into conflicting with other people's changes in that code. And we can't merge them both in together. And that's slowing us down. And so listening for where that frustration is happening between different team members, that's usually the points of most value, I think, for somebody with DevOps to come in and to improve that situation. So just some examples of what that might look like. For example, like with the merge conflicts, it might be trying to make sure that back merges are happening more regularly or automatically, even, so that somebody's dev branch has all these small changes coming in automatically. And so that when they get to a merge conflict, which those are inevitably going to happen, it's at least as small as possible. It's just about some very specific changes, which should ideally be more recent and more familiar to whoever is developing on it. Or it could be, I mentioned, if reviews are taking a long time, maybe it's looking for ways to speed them up by encouraging smaller changes, or maybe it's even automating a lot of the test process so that if reviews are finding just like these simple tests are failing, maybe we can notify the developers earlier so a review doesn't even need to happen yet because it's not ready. So looking for those points on the testing side, of course, it could be just running a lot more regression tests, if possible, earlier on. So on the QA team, they're not having to run as many long, repetitive tests that is really just eating up their time rather than them like focusing on some of those more creative situations I talked about. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's just listening to the team for the most part, and finding ways where you can support. So I would say specifically on the Salesforce side of things, beyond some of the ones I just mentioned, I found that metadata manipulation and being helping a team get better about how changes are being deployed, either to scratch orgs if they're an ISV and doing scratch org development, or if they're a customer and using sandboxes. There's often just some challenges around metadata being deployed. Maybe it's overwriting changes you don't want it to. Maybe it's not deploying correctly. Maybe it's not deploying automatically. I found there's like a lot of value for somebody with a DevOps mindset to come in and say, hey, we've got this branching structure, we've got this org structure. How can we automate it so that when you make a change here, it's getting deployed properly, and in a way that's not slowing you down and is a way that's just helping you do your job quicker.
Yeah, yeah. That brings me really nicely onto one of my points. So you've got experience of a couple of what I would say are different flavors of DevOps. So you talked about ISVs who might be doing ISV like kind of style package development, and customers that have your typical sandbox to sandbox style deployments, and associated branching strategies if they have them. What are kind of some of the key differences between those flavors, and what what are kind of in your mind, the things that are applicable to both, and the things that are separate, or the real key areas of consideration that need to be different for those environments? Something that comes up a lot working at Gearset and the ISVs that we work with, as well as the end user customers that we work with. But it'd be really interesting to hear your take on those kind of differences and explain why they're different.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I mean, I think you're already beginning to touch on it, but I'd say one of the big differences, and I will caveat that my personal bread and butter and expertise is especially on the ISV side. As I mentioned, that's where I've worked the most, but I've worked some with sandboxes and some other tools out there. I think one of the big differences today is just the number and the maturity of tools on the customer versus partner side. Um, Definitely on the customer side, like GearSet, like Salesforce DevOps Center, and many other big tools out there, there is this marketplace and this emphasis on some pretty mature point and click tools. On the ISV side, that's less so. There are some great ones. CI is one of my favorites, an open source tool that was actually built at Salesforce. And then there's some other newer ones coming up, like Hute, which is a European company. And so there are some that are coming up. Some of them I think are really capable, like CI, but they're not going to have like a full company supporting it in the same way with a nice UI, and this kind of like certification process, things like that. That's one of the big differences. Part of the reason is the customer marketplace is just so much larger compared to the ISV marketplace. Um, and so there's tooling. I think I mentioned earlier scratch orgs versus sandboxes. Definitely you can develop, technically you could, I think, develop with either on either end, but generally speaking, it's much easier for a ISV to work with scratch orgs. And I think one day that'll be the case for customers, but currently today, sandboxes are still the easiest way to develop for most, just because of the fact that um, you have a starting place that's similar to your production org, and it basically comes out of the box with a lot more in it versus a
Yeah.
scratch org. And so that's one of the big differences. Once you start getting to, I'd say, like the metadata level, you start to see a lot more similarities in that if you're manipulating metadata in the org, so metadata, just data about the org. Usually you get to give it as like the settings data. When it comes to manipulating that data, whether it's a sandbox, whether it's a scratch org, generally speaking, there's a lot of similarities there. Whether you're like deploying a profile, it's going to be pretty much the same for sandbox or scratch org. there's some nuances in what kind of APIs you're using and what effect that can have. But big picture, the way you're doing deployments could be really similar. I was starting to mention this connection between branching and environments. That part
Hmm.
can also be somewhat similar. Usually, you want to set up your branching model and your environments, those scratch orgs or sandboxes. You want to set them up at least in kind of like a one-to-one manner. With the scratch orgs, you do have the advantage of being able to usually just generate more of those easily on demand, which can just be a benefit to developers. And so
Hmm.
that's another consideration is like you have that extra benefit with scratch orgs where with sandboxes, they tend to be a lot more difficult to generate. And so they're going to be more long lived. But big picture, I think the strategies you deploy tend to be the same. Like you're thinking about whatever environments they're using, how to make it easier for those developers, whether it's moving around the metadata, whether it's like automating tests running in those environments. Once you take a layer back into the technical side, that's tends to be where you get the differences of how do you actually set this up? Are you having to care about authenticating to orgs, or can you just generate them on the fly in the scratch situation?
Yeah. Um, you touch again on branching and sandbox management or environment management if you're using Scratch orgs as well. What would you say if for any let's say you're not let's I don't like to exclude anybody on the podcast, but if you're not a organization that has 10 to 20 Salesforce users, we're talking slightly larger SMB towards mid market, maybe enterprise. What do you think is the minimum the minimum number of sandboxes or stages in the development flow for best practice at a reasonable, if you're a reasonable size, say you're a company of 100 Salesforce users, and you have a couple of admins, maybe a developer, etc. How many stages in your development cycle do you think there should be in terms of sandboxes to make sure that everything is happening correctly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say minimum. It all depends on how you set things up, but
It all depends. That's
it's yeah,
DevOps.
but it's hard to imagine having a good setup and not at minimum having a UAT sandbox or basically a sandbox that hopefully is a full sandbox or at least a partial sandbox before you're getting to production. And this is kind of like a final closest to production staging area where you can do testing in. So that's, I would say, at a minimum. Um, and then beyond that, I, I usually see in a lot of organizations, they might have kind of a series of sandboxes below that, just depending on the number of projects they're working on. And so they might have like a group of external consultants, they have their own sandbox. And then they might have their internal team working on just Service Cloud. And they have other clouds that they use, but they're just working on this one piece. And then they're promoting changes um, up into that UAT. It's probably not even a terrible idea to have like another environment between those two because I think your partial or full sandbox, you might want to kind of have some extra protection around it because it tends to be a lot more difficult to refresh it, a lot more expensive time wise and effort
Mhm.
wise if it does have some issues in it. And so you might even have another in between. So right there, I think it's not unreasonable to think of having two and then plus one per project. And then from there, I think it's also common to have maybe even additional sandboxes for developers. And that depends on, this probably begins to depend on like how mature your DevOps process is, because basically the more sandboxes you're going to have, the more complexity you're going to have in terms of needing to move that metadata, move those changes around. So
Mhm.
if you're using like a great tool to help you move that around and you have your processes pretty honed in, it's hopefully not that much extra effort to give maybe each team their own sandbox, if not each developer their own sandbox, and then to be able to promote those changes, especially if you have them tied up with that branching model with version control, so that that becomes a source of truth, and then you can just move the changes around version control and they tie into sandboxes. But if you don't have that all set up, it's probably still advantageous to have fewer sandboxes, just so you're not spending a whole lot of time really folk uh, I'd say wasting your time kind of like trying to figure out where the changes are and move them around and
Yeah.
forget what's going on there. But the issue right there so much isn't like the number of sandboxes as much as it is not having that, I think, development process, not using version control as your source of truth. Yeah.
hmm Yeah, I think one of those things that comes up quite a lot is drift between sandboxes. Like sandbox drift, it becomes like quite a big issue, especially the larger an organization is and the number of sandboxes. When was this last refreshed, or like how close actually is that to production or the most recent code, and that's where we find version control really underpins all of that in terms of it being able to refresh and prevent that drift for sure. That in and of itself is obviously a challenge. Preventing that drift and making sure Sandbox stay up to date is obviously crucially important to having a nice smooth flow to automated deployments when you eventually get there. If there's huge disparities in what's happened, you'll either have to start doing some clever stuff like with deltas and all this kind of stuff to be able to continue to move it at that velocity. Um, sandbox drift aside, are there any of the challenges that you see more often in DevOps processes over anything else in the organizations that you've worked in and the projects that you've worked on?
Yeah. There's the challenges. I think just getting your unit tests running, which seems like an obvious one, but um, really running the tests that you've got as often as possible. Um, I would call that maybe like a hidden challenge. A lot of organizations might not think it's something that they need to be doing, where it might not come, top of mind. But often there's like some hidden issues there that already exist. Like if you're not running your unit tests often, if you're waiting until it gets promoted, especially when you compound in something like sandbox drift, then you're basically getting easy information, easy useful information that you could have early on. You're getting it way late in the process unnecessarily, which is just costing you more than you need to. And so, really thinking about like why not run unit tests every time that a code change comes in, if we can. Um, Again, like setting, I think this is all presupposing that you have some effort to having those good DevOps processes in. So I can understand why
Uh,
not maybe day one, but assuming you're already going down this path, really thinking about can we run our tests more often? Why or why not? If they're taking way too long, can we at least run a subset of them? Starting to think about that. Very similarly, just thinking about how can we expand unit tests. That's often the cheapest way to get good information. And if we don't, first of all, if we don't have really high code coverage, there's a great podcast, by the way, by David Reed about why everybody can have 100% code coverage and why it's not as elusive as you might think. Just really thinking about if, like, how can we increase, yes, our code coverage, but really just the quality of our unit tests and test things that can we mock things, situations today that we maybe at first are thinking that we can't do it, but if we think creatively, are there ways that we can mock this so that we can get the answers in unit tests and get all these things, learn these things early on, so we don't even have to worry as much about learning this information down the line. Um, Beyond that, I think, I mean, I know there can be a lot of challenges when it comes to deploying metadata to an org, and it's not uncommon to get just really odd errors and frustrating errors. I can definitely relate. There's many times where I've gotten an error. Maybe it's even because of a Salesforce major release. It's the error you've never seen before, and then you start getting it.
mm,
And so I think just keeping up to date and keeping current with uh, with your development with your deployment process, making sure that if you're dependent on other tools, those can go out of date. For example, like Node uh, recently had some like old versions deprecated, and that could impact your whole deployment process. Um, this is really where I think you have a DevOps engineer come in and like are watching these different things. Can be really useful to have that person. But yeah, just keeping current, and like using some of the tools and resources that are out there that even Salesforce provides. For example, I mentioned like a major release. Sometimes those can break your changes. Well, you can actually build preview orgs or pre-release orgs, maybe even up to like a month out before a Salesforce major release. So you can start getting that information early on. It doesn't have to You don't have to wait to run your unit tests and to even do like general like regression testing. You don't have to wait until the day a major release comes out. You could start this weeks before and start fixing any issues that come up. Um, yeah, those are a few of the things that come to mind.
Yeah, it's quite it's been enlightening in the last 4.5 years that I've worked in this space is how many times folks will get to a production deployment and have like unit tests fail and code coverage prevent a production release. Um, and the amount it does come up, like it seems if you spend enough time in this world, you think that that is like the most obvious thing to do. Like, why would you not be doing it? You kind of almost assume that it's being done as like a de facto thing. But um, that's really reassuring to hear from you and yourself that it is something that a lot of teams and organizations maybe don't think about, maybe think about early enough, and is an easy way to prevent issues down the line. I think I was working with a customer, and uh, Gearset Gearset does daily unit testing on all of your orgs for you if you wanted to do that. And they said that because they had that insight every day to running those tests and seeing what was changing and seeing what might be breaking, it allowed them to go back and refactor what they needed to refactor, and add tests and coverage where it needed to allow the rest of their process to run smoothly. So, that's super resonant, and definitely tallies with what I've seen in the ecosystem for sure. Um, if we think about the best best resources, so you mentioned David Reed's podcast there about unit testing. What are some of the best resources that you've come across for folks that are looking to either they're either in leadership or management roles, or folks that are more interested in doing more of the release management and DevOps engineering style roles? What are the best resources that you found out there that folks can go and learn more from, or where would you advise them to go and look if they want to invest a little bit more heavily in this space?
Yeah. So yeah, obviously podcasts like these can be really great. And there's another like podcast actually by Hute. That was another tool I mentioned. That's more on the ISV side, or at least I know some of their tooling, especially known there. Um, Beyond that, though, I would actually really recommend looking at some of the existing CI/CD tools out there that are not necessarily Salesforce specific. And so, for example, GitHub Actions is a really great tool that I think everybody could be using, at least if you're already using GitHub repo. But even if you're not, just thinking about other ways to employ these like basically little pieces of automation to make your process smoother. And on top of that, there are a lot of just great Salesforce repos out there where people have built open source tools that can be used with GitHub Actions, that can simplify the process, make things simpler. Um, I'll do a self plug for my own portfolio. I've got
That's
some.
allowed. That's totally allowed, by the way. That's okay.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe it'll be a link in the notes somewhere, but yeah, I've got
Yeah,
a
we'll
few
pop a link in
videos
the
on there.
description. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. I got a few videos just on like, using things like CumulCI I mentioned earlier. Um, but I've seen some good YouTube videos out there, in the Trailblazer community. For example, there are a few groups. There's a test automation group, which, as I mentioned earlier, kind of lends itself to DevOps in a lot of ways. A lot of people thinking about how to automate with Salesforce, automate at least UI tests, and that's basically I think where the DevOps piece comes in. There's a Cumulus CI group. There's a Salesforce DX group in the Trailblazer community. Those are some great resources. Yeah. Also, there's I know I'm not as involved here, but there is a Discord community, and I'm trying to think. SFDX or sorry, SFXD is the
Yeah.
Discord community. I know that's a really active one, and I've seen a lot of people just in the DevOps space asking these questions, posting in there. Yeah, so there's a lot of good stuff out there.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I love the Discord. I don't spend a lot of time in it, as much time in it as I used to, but that is a super great space. Often a lot of great conversation in there for sure. So that gets an extra plug from me as well. Um, what as we kind of look to wrap up and look to the future a little bit, where do you where do you think DevOps is heading in the ecosystem? What kind of are some of your predictions that we might see through 2024, 2025? Um, and what would you like to see either vendors focus on in the ecosystem or Salesforce focus themselves on to support people in the mission of faster, more efficient, less turbulent deployments?
Yeah, yeah. I selfishly will say I hope it's on hiring more Salesforce DevOps engineers. But specifically, I guess what I've seen a lot of is an appetite from leaders to not just take this idea that things are messy and this is the way it has to be. I've seen that, especially from those who are maybe like new to the Salesforce space, a leader who hasn't been in Salesforce, but then just takes on, let's say, leadership of several Salesforce teams. And all of a sudden they see, oh, this is just frustrating. And this is just the way Salesforce is. Unfortunately, especially outside the Salesforce community, I think sometimes it has that reputation of Salesforce can't really do DevOps the same way that other teams can do it. And I think there is some truth to the fact that Salesforce as a platform is just different. The fact that it is cloud based and that you can't really develop locally in the same ways you can. And that's both, it can make it more difficult, but there's a lot of advantages as well. And I think
Hmm.
with the addition of Scratchworks and SFDX and now all these open source tools, I think Salesforce and the community is kind of like taken on this responsibility of let's modernize in a lot of ways, but let's do it in a way that still respects like the value of being always being able to develop in the cloud and always in a sense being able to develop in a real environment to a certain degree, and the fact that it's at least on the
Yeah.
internet and something that you actually have to think about limits even when you're developing in. And so I think there's been this reputation of it being more difficult, but I think finally leaders are coming around to part of the reason is we just haven't invested properly in solving this issue. And yes, it does take some learning, it does take some education and effort, but we don't have to like sit with the status quo of it's messy just because it is. There actually are tools, there are actually people, experts out there that can help us with this. And especially when we're in a situation where we have two, three, four Scrum teams all working on Salesforce, but we don't have somebody who's like thinking about from a DevOps perspective how these teams work and adding value here. We're actually like missing out on a lot of opportunity. It's not just the way it has to be. It's we can improve this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree, and I think that is one of the, the things that we've had to have been quite conscious on, especially spending as much time as I do in the ecosystem, and a lot of time talking about DevOps itself is getting that engagement from leadership, and the that it's always been done this way mindset is a killer sometimes, and can really just like kill something dead if the vision isn't there to move beyond that. So yes, I think it's fantastic to have other folks in the ecosystem and folks like yourself, Julian, in the ecosystem that are advocating for that, and that do realize that there is a better way and have the plethora of experience that you do in solving these challenges, to help visualize that for sure. Um, Julian, thank you so much for your time and coming on to the DevOps Diaries podcast. I think you've given the listeners a lot of food for thought and also quite a bit of enlightenment into the specifics of what DevOps engineers do and how those that are more interested in it can develop themselves in that area, in that space. So I really value your time. Is there any closing comments or anything else that you'd like to say to the listeners before I let you go here?
Yeah, no, just thank you so much for having me. I am just interested in continued conversations with anybody who wants to chat about DevOps. Either they're thinking about a career transition or they just have questions about their organization. I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit and all the other social platforms. I actually just bought julian.social, the domain. So maybe I'll have the redirect up pretty soon. And so if you want to come find me there, but at the very least, if you look for me, Julian Joseph on LinkedIn, always happy to have a conversation. I love to just chat. It doesn't have to even be anything business related, just like talking about this subject, hearing where people are at. Yeah, especially learning some of the skills and making a career transition, that always excites me too. So yeah, just love to get this kind of knowledge out there and hear where other people are at.
Perfect. Julian, thank you so much. The links to Julian's profiles are in the description for this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in, and thank you for making it to this stage. If you have made it to this stage and you've enjoyed the podcast, then be sure to hit a like and subscribe button on whatever platform that you're listening on. And I've been your host, Jack McCurdy, and I will catch you another time on the DevOps Diaries podcast. Thank you very much.